And we'll start. Okay, so tonight's shiur is going to be on the subject of using electricity for Nerot Shabbat. The last class we talked about using electricity for Chanukiah and what the halachot are. What is the halacha for using electricity for lighting the candles of Chanukah? And we went into Chacham Ovadiah's analysis of that and his conclusion. But he was actually already presupposing that we would know what he had discussed about Nerot Shabbat. So we're going to take a step back or take a step forward, depending on how you look at it, and take and examine how he treats the situation in two distinct teshuvot. Now you can see from the way that he approaches the subject in these teshuvot that the one that's printed second in this packet is actually the first one. You can see because the conclusions are so different. But we'll see. Not to jump ahead. So now on top should be familiar to you by now, looks like Yechaveh Da'at, okay? This is the simpler, shorter tshuvot of Chacham Ovadiah, the ones that were based on his radio show that he used to give. And what's the question? Ha'im yotz'im yedei chovat hadlakat hanerot shel Shabbat b'morach hashmal. So do you fulfill the mitzvah of lighting Shabbat candles with electric lights? Oh, tzarich ladlik nerot Shabbat b'shemen. Or what about, that's the case, yeah. So when you go to the hospital, you go to a hotel, you go on a cruise, they don't want candles being lit. So what do you do? So that's the question. Or do you have to have oil or do you have to have wax? So what does he say? So first he starts, just like he started, if you recall, if you were here for the shiur where we discussed Chanukah, in Yechaveh Da'at, he frequently begins with a more liberal view and then gets into the issues with it and then comes back around. And that's what he does here too. He says, HaGaon, Rabbi Yitzchak Shmalkis. Sounds like a good Sephardic posek. No, I don't know who he was exactly. B'shelot u'shvat Bet Yitzchak, pasak, sheyotz'im yidei chovat adlakat nerot Shabbat b'morach hashmal. So he said that there was, first of all, a posek, very well regarded, Bet Yitzchak, that says.
Isn't he Dutch?
I'm not sure where he was from. I'm not sure.
He's one of.
I never heard the name.
I've heard the name before, but I'm not sure his history. I'm not sure. But he said that you could use electric lights. Umevarchem alav asher kedishanu b'mitzvot havetzivanu lahadik ner shel Shabbat. So he says that not only can you use, let's say you're in a hotel and you want to light the lamp as your Shabbat candle, you can light it and say lahadik ner shel Shabbat. You can say the bracha. Shekol ma'ora mechubar leptilat shemen or sha'ava nikra ner, because any light that's connected to some kind of a wick of oil or wax is called a candle. Avafkan shamor nitla bechutei hashmal nikra ner, and here you have electrical wire. That's also a type of petilah. He says that's also a type of wick. It's an electrical one. So therefore you can say the blessing. He says certainly you could even light a gas range and say the bracha of lahadik ner shel Shabbat. So that's what he says about Shabbat. Now, what I want, really my goal in this particular teshuvah or this series where we're doing these things about electricity is not so much to get into the final answer, although we're going to see the final answer, but to see how halacha, as a general rule, how does halacha engage with new circumstances. In other words, does halacha evolve or not? This is a question that people ask. Does the halacha change? Does the halacha evolve? Or is what happens that the principles stay the same, but the mitziut changes? The situation changes. In other words, when you have circumstances that never before existed, how do you deal with them in halacha when the halacha written 2,000 years ago in the Talmud didn't have this situation? So for example, 2,000 years ago, if you asked Rabbi Akiva, what would happen if I could make light come in a bulb without any match and without any oil and without any fuel? He would say, that's crazy. There's no such thing, so there's no question. Now we have a situation where you allow an electric current to travel through a wire and it comes into a filament, and through the traveling it creates light. So Rabbi Akiva never saw that. So you couldn't ask him that question. So the question is going to become, what was the intention of the original halacha? So we have to ask questions about the halacha that we never asked before. Now sometimes the Talmud surprises us. Sometimes the Talmud will have crazy, we know that the Gemara is famous for cases that will never happen in real life. theoretical, hypothetical cases that are mind-boggling, almost don't make any sense. They're difficult to imagine why they came up with the case. But why did they bring the case? To explore the theory. So, for example, this is not on our topic, but I like to use this example to illustrate how the rabbis thought. So there's a Mishnah that speaks about Yesh Bechor Lenachala. Okay, there's such a thing as a Bechor Lenachala and a Bechor Lepidyon. So a Bechor for inheritance and a Bechor for Pidyon Ben. Two different kinds of Bechor. A Bechor Lenachala, a Bechor, a firstborn who inherits a double portion from his father. Even if he's born from a C-section, he's a Bechor. It doesn't matter. It's your first child. It doesn't matter how it came out. But a Bechor Lepidyon, for Pidyon Ben, it has to be Peterechem. It has to be naturally born. So the Mishnah talks about a case. What happens if a woman has one baby, which is called Yotze Dofen, Caesarean section, and then later has another baby that comes out Peterechem? So one will be the first child, the one that came out of the wall of the womb is Caesarean section, would be the firstborn child, but the one that came through the natural birth is Peterechem. It's the first one. It's the first one to go through the womb in a natural way. That's the question. So, in other words, the Mishnah talks about this case. And what are the commentaries, the Rishonim even, that lived in the medieval time? What do they say? This case makes no sense. Why doesn't it make any sense?
They didn't have those kind of...
Because if a child came out of the side of a woman, the woman died. Right, in those days. There was no such... You couldn't sew her back. You could cut her open to take the baby out, but you wouldn't be able to seal up afterwards. They didn't have surgery. In other words, if the woman was going to die in childbirth and they had no choice, they would do that. They would cut the woman's belly and take the baby out. But they didn't know how to put her back together afterwards. So there was no such case as a baby coming out the side and then coming through. Nowadays, we have C-section. So we read this Mishnah and we say, oh, of course, the woman had C-section. I mean, even if you go back 30 years, they wouldn't do that. If you had a C-section once, they said you can never have a natural birth again. But nowadays, they will let you do it. So the Mishnah, written, thousands of years ago, had this case that nobody could make any sense out of it, and now we can make sense out of it. Now, in the case of electricity, we have the opposite problem, which is they didn't really have a situation where you could have light without fuel, where you could have light without a fire to start it. So that's where these problems emerge. So the first opinion, the Bet Yitzchak says, you know what? The bottom line is you have light. It's light. And it's attached to a little thing that looks like a wick, the filament, and there's a light there. So what's the problem? You have what you need.
Robert, today even no filament. You have a gas.
Well, that's a bigger problem. Because there you don't have, at least the filament, there's something that's like a patila and there's real fire. The fluorescent light is just a gas that's light, it's not even hot. It's a whole different thing. We're dealing with incandescent bulbs because fluorescent bulbs are a whole other problem. Fluorescent bulbs wouldn't really be considered fire at all. There's definitely no fire. It's just that the exposure of when the gas and the current come into contact, the gas lights up. But there's no fire at all in the case of a fluorescent bulb.
I thought they don't consider electricity as fire in the first place.
Well, that's going to come up. Let's hold on to that one. So let's get to that. So, okay, so he quotes two authorities that say right off the top, listen, if you have an incandescent bulb, which is going to be illegal soon, they're not going to allow you to buy or make them in the regular incandescent bulbs anymore, so you better go stock up. So so if you have a regular incandescent bulb, it could be considered a fire. Ulam, Hagaon Rabbi Mordechai Winkler, לבושי מרדכי פסק שאין יוצאים חובת הדלקה בנרות חשמל כי צריך להיות שמן ופתילה דווקא לעיכובה, which means you need a fuel and a wick. And yes, you could argue that maybe the filament is like a wick, but there's definitely no fuel in an electric bulb. No fuel. Right? Electricity is not fuel. It's a current traveling along that creates the fire, so to speak, on the end of the filament, but there's no fuel. So now he brings a story from the Gemara. This is a very, very famous story about Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. His daughter was crying one Friday night. Why was she crying? Very famous story in Masechet Shabbat. Accidentally, instead of filling the Shabbat candles with oil, and lighting them as she was supposed to. She accidentally filled the Shabbat candles with chometz, with vinegar, and lit that instead. And we know that vinegar is not going to burn very well, it's going to go out. So Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa said, don't worry. Hashem, who made the oil burn, He can also make the chometz, He can also make the vinegar burn, and of course it burned, not only did it burn the entire Shabbat, and they used it for Havdalah. That was the story. Now, because Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa had miracles happen all the time. So that was the story, but what was the relevance of this to our discussion? So the relevance of this discussion was, he says, V'lechora kasher. It's still difficult, and that's where I underlined there. Because adayin halal letatev, even though it turned out that the light burned for Shabbat. In other words, originally it sounded like, why was Rabbi Chanina's daughter upset? Because there wasn't going to be any light for Shabbat. It was going to go out on Friday night, and they were going to be sitting in the dark because she lit vinegar. But otherwise, she didn't have any problem. Her problem was that she wanted it to be lit. But wait a second. You just told me that in order to have a Shabbat candle, you need what? An oil or fuel and a wick. She didn't have a fuel. She had vinegar.
But maybe vinegar was a fuel in that case.
Only by a miracle it turned out to be, right? So he asks, he says, Ima brachal shel nerot Shabbat nitkena davka al petilat shemen o b'sha'ava l'ikuva adayin ha'ila letatzev al sheberecha bracha levatala. She said a bracha on something that wasn't really a candle. So why isn't she still upset? Okay, she had the light that she needed, but she didn't do the mitzvah. She should be upset she didn't do the mitzvah because vinegar. So what is Chacham Ovadia bringing this? Perhaps we can learn from this that it doesn't matter how you get the light. Okay? In other words, it doesn't matter. She got the result. Tachlis they call it, right? She got the result. Light. We have the result. We have these bulbs that give light. Who cares if it came with shemen, if it came with chometz, if it came with whatever you can use, it works.
So what about Lamei Madikim?
So right. No, you're right. In the end it says V'chachamim matirin b'chol hashemanim. Right. So you could interpret that as meaning it doesn't matter. As long as you have a good light, we don't care. B'chol hashemanim. Right? Everything is good. So anything goes. Shari nosach habrachad lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. So he says that how could she say lahadlik ner shel Shabbat? She didn't really have a candle. Okay, that's a diuk he's trying to make from the story that you see. She wasn't upset that she didn't do the mitzvah. So obviously it counted as the mitzvah. The light was going to go out. She thought the light was going to go out. That was her concern. But once he said, no, don't worry, the light's not going to go out, it didn't bother her that she didn't have a valid fuel. In other words, because he's saying, what you're saying here is we don't have a valid fuel. Fine, we have a light, the electric incandescent bulb, it gives a light, but there's no fuel. But look, Rabbi Chanina's daughter didn't care if there was a fuel or not. She didn't say, I didn't light a valid fuel, so even though I have light, I'm still upset because I didn't do the mitzvah, and I said a bracha and I didn't do the mitzvah. She didn't say that. So you see that it doesn't matter whether you have a valid fuel or not. Anything that tachlis, anything that functions, right? For giving light, that's enough. So that's what he wants to argue, and he says that there's a mitzvah in the lighting itself. It's not just the result. There has to be a lighting. וכן כתבו התוספות בשם רבנו תם שאם היה נר דלוק ועומד צריך לכבותו ולחזור להדליקו לכבוד שבת. In other words, the hadlaka is part of the mitzvah. When you light the candle, you have to light it l'shem mitzvah. So for example, if you had a candle, a yard side candle, those 7-day candles. You say, you know what, I'm not going to get back in time for Shabbat, I'm going to get back, not enough time to light the candles, I'm going away on vacation. Right now I'm going to put a 7-day yard side candle, whatever they call the Shiva candle. I'm going to come back home 5 minutes before Shabbat. I won't have time to light the candle, but I'll have the candle already set. So you can't do that. You have to light it l'shem mitzvah on the eve of Shabbat. So you will have, in other words, that shows you that even though you have the result of the light, you need the performance. You need to do the action l'chvod Shabbat. And why is she not bothered by the fact that she didn't light a valid fuel? If she didn't do the performance, she can't only be concerned. In other words, there are 2 elements to be concerned with here. Element 1 is whether there's a light in the house or not. About that, Rabbi Chanina told her, don't worry, it's going to continue to burn. But element number 2 is, did she do the mitzvah or not? And that question is going to hinge on whether this is a valid candle. And if it's not a valid candle because it doesn't have a recognizable fuel, then she didn't do the ma'aseh mitzvah. The ma'aseh mitzvah she did not do. She got the result, but without the ma'aseh mitzvah. So why is she not upset? And look at the underlined part. Ela vadai sha'ikar sheyeh davar adolek mafitz or. So he says that the essence is that you have something that's burning and giving light. And as long as what you set up is burning and giving light, that is enough to satisfy the obligation. So she could have lit a watermelon, and that would be good enough. She could light chometz, vinegar, and that's enough. She lights oil, that's enough. She lights an electric light, that would also be enough. That's what he's saying. Okay, so that would say v'kol sheken b'm'ora chashmal. So, in other words, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, because of the miracle that happened, it was rendered a valid candle. Fine, it functioned. The fact is that she set up something. You might ask, well, yeah, but at the time she set it up, it wasn't a valid candle, so how can we give her credit for it, right? So he says, limafreya, retroactively it turned out that it was all fine. She did it. She did the mitzvah. She lit a valid fuel because of the miracle. But lighting an electric light shouldn't be any different than lighting chometz, because in both cases you don't have a recognizable fuel, but you have the result, and you did it. You put it in place. So that would seem to lean towards the conclusion that what fuel is burning, or whether a fuel is burning or not, is not relevant. What's relevant is that you did an action before the onset of Shabbat that provided light in the house on Shabbat, whatever that might be. Because that's what she did, and she was happy when she knew that the light would be there. V'tabet eni la'gaon Rabbi Shimon Greenfeld. So he quotes another responsum here. Shenishal bazeh v'katav lo uchal lomar davar barur benidon zeh. So in this particular collection of Shelot and Shuvot, he says it's called Shelot and Shuvot Maharshag. He said, I can't say anything clear here. Why? Ki eneni baki betiva inyan shel orach hashmal. Because listen, I'm not an electrician. I'm not a physicist. I don't know how electricity works. So he brings in a different argument. Now, why is this important? Again, it's important not so much because of the conclusions that everybody gets to. It's important to see how halacha is adapted or applied to modern circumstances. So we have a situation here that never existed in the history of mankind, which is that you have a light that shines just as well as a candle, but there's no shalhevet. There is no flame. There's a glowing light, but no flame. So he says, "Ve'en yecholim lahadlik mimenu davar." What do I define as shalhevet? You could light something else from it. In other words, if you look back at what the Chachamim set up as the mitzvah of Nerot Shabbat, and you want to interpret it, you have to ask yourself, what was the essence of what they said? Did they require a fuel, or they said anything that provides light? But they were talking in their time. In their time, there were a limited number of options that you had for providing light. But had the Chachamim seen electricity, they would say that's also fine. Or would they say, no, we wanted a flame. The flame is important. We told you to light a flame. And if there's no flame, we would say that that's not good, even if they saw electricity. The question is, how would their principle apply to today's life? Now, yes.
Why can't the intent become part of the discussion?
Well, it does. Okay. It does become. We're going to see. It does become. In a way, it is.
Because the intent of the ner is so you should have light on Shabbat.
Right. Ner daluk. That's what it says. You're right. And that it does come in. So he says, whatever's causing the light is a hidden force, right? The electricity, it's not visible. He says, consider, you have like certain kinds of fine gems that also give off radiance. You can use that. Okay, what if you had some kind of special, those, what are those things that they put on the kids' walls, that they light up at night, the fluorescent things? Right? That you could put on the wall in the kids' room that it makes it look like light? Yeah, or those fluorescent, something like that definitely can't be near Shabbat. So what's it? who is a koch ish, and even if you're going to say that electricity is like fire, the fact is that filament is just like a smoldering gachelet. It's like a smoldering piece of charcoal. It's like an ember. It's not like a real flame. Ube'emet. So now Chacham Ovadia is very interesting the way that he responds to this. Okay, so basically the argument is twofold. He says, first of all, there's no flame. Second of all, even if it's fire, even if it's not a hidden force, but it's actually fire, it's only a smoldering ember of filament. There's no real flame there.
Yeah, but that's a good issue. What if, and you could have had it in those days, although whether it would last 24 hours, I don't know. You could have had embers,
Right, embers, right.
Yeah, you make a fire and it's glowing. So what if somehow you did it in such a way that...
Like you had a fireplace. Like what if you had a fireplace? Would that be good enough? Right.
I don't know that it'll last 24 hours, but the principle of having...
It doesn't last 24 hours. Shabbat candle lasts 6 hours.
What he did was light some kind of coal.
Would that be enough?
Yeah.
That would be the same question. I think that if you asked him that, he would have the same problem. He would say, no, I don't consider that a ner either.
Because
there's a difference between saying lahadlik ner and lahadlik ish. Why does it say lahadlik ner shel Shabbat? It doesn't say lahadlik ish shel Shabbat. If it were any kind of burning thing, then it would have said lahadlik ish shel Shabbat. Why does it say lahadlik ner shel Shabbat? So they distinguish between like a madura, something which is a fireplace, a bonfire, and a candle. He says it has to be a candle. A candle means a flame.
Well, a bonfire would be okay, but that's because the flames...
Because it has flames, but right.
Just the embers are glowing.
It would be the same question. Did the Chachamim mean it has to be a candle? Or is anything that glows good enough? It's the same question. So Chacham Ovadia picks up on the fact that this particular rabbi said, I don't really know how electricity works. He says, Ube'emet, shenira midvav shel berabi, she'eno baki klal b'inyan hachashmal. He's like, he's right. He doesn't understand how electricity works. Very complimentary. He says, well, he's right about one thing. Maybe not about his conclusion, but about the fact that he doesn't know how it works. Kasher ha'id al atzmo, as he said about himself. Of course, this is not true either. He says that the truth is, electricity is fire. Okay, it's a burning fire. That's what he says. Now, that's not really true. But let's keep going. Somebody who turns on electricity is violating lo tevaru esh, not to light a fire on Shabbat. Now, today, if you asked most poskim based on a more modern understanding of electricity, they will tell you that that's true if the electricity is connected to an actual incandescent bulb or a filament where there's a real fire. But electricity itself is not fire. The traveling of current is not fire. What's fire is what could be on the other end of the electricity, not the electricity itself.
Like an oven?
Right, like an oven that heats up where you have fire.
Not really fire, even that, it's just heating up.
Heating something till it's red hot is considered like bishul, so that's a different story. Or if you light an incandescent bulb, there's really a burning.
The bulb is not burning, it's just heating.
The filament actually gets red hot.
But
and if it were exposed to, if it didn't have the glass around it, it would be a fire. The glass is what keeps it only smoldering because
the actual analog would be if there was a fire and on Shabbat you took a piece of metal, put it in the fire until it was glowing.
That would not be allowed for sure. That would be
of course it's not allowed, but would that be doing?
Yeah, that would be bishul there, right? Actually,
well,
yeah, to light a metal till it's red hot.
That's considered bishul?
Yeah.
Even though it doesn't involve any...
Yeah, it would be considered bishul because it changes the state of the metal.
Well,
to soften it.
It may not soften the metal, it may just glow.
True, it may just, but I mean, but that's the definition of... that's one of the categories of bishul, to light something till it becomes... a hot metal. So that's a separate problem. But he's taking that, you know what, because the Chachamim said that you're not allowed to turn on lights on Shabbat, then we're treating it like fire, which is not exactly scientifically accurate, but it doesn't matter. But if you skip down to where the underline is, ubeshelot utshuvot nachalat Shimon he'id shehagaon Rabbi Chaim Ibris kaya noeg levarich b'motzei Shabbat borei me'orei ha'esh al orach hashmal. That there were certain rabbis who specifically used electric lights to say borei me'orei ha'esh on motzei Shabbat. Why? כדי להוציא מלב הטועים שחושבים שאין החשמל בכלל איסור העברת אש בשבת מן התורה. Because many people thought electricity was okay to use on Shabbat. They wanted to show it's fire. And what's the proof that it's fire? I'm going to use it for Havdalah. And he brings some other opinions that agreed with this. Ve'omnam. Okay, so now, so up till now he's saying to us, okay, we dealt with the issue of whether you need a fuel or not in the candle. And we said, okay, maybe you don't really need a fuel. What you need is a light that's going to be lasting. Then the question came up, is it really considered fire or not? And he's now taking the position that it is indeed considered fire. Now, if that's the case, you have a third question, which is, "Ve'omnam gam b'shelot teshuvot pekudat Elazar katav lepakpek benidon shelanu, mishum she'en kan pe'olat hadlaka mamash." You have a different problem of candles, which is that the way you light an electric light is not the way that you light a candle. In other words, the performance looks different. You just flip a switch, whereas a candle is lit in a certain form. You take fire and you light the candle. When you light an electric light, you flip a switch and the light goes on. It doesn't have the form of lighting. Okay, but he says, "Ulam lafia mivuar le'el b'shem kol ha'gedolim hanal shamadik chashmal b'shabbat chayav min haTorah mishum avir esh b'shabbat yesh lilmod she'adlaka gemura." He says, but if we have to be consistent. So if we're going to say that turning on a light on Shabbat is considered to be lighting a fire, then we also have to say that turning on a light on Shabbat is considered lighting a fire for Shabbat candles. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say, well, we're not going to let you do it on Shabbat because it's considered lighting up. When you flip the switch and there's a flame inside the bulb, it's considered lighting a fire. Okay? But for Shabbat candles, it's no good. That's not. You have to be the same. Is it madlik or not?
This is in the 70s?
I'm not sure exactly when this was written. I'm not sure. Now he brings another concern. Now this concern you can see is dated. This is from Chacham Uziel. So you're talking about going back to the 50s probably. Okay? So he says...
I think he passed away in 40 years.
Oh, 40. No, he was the first chief rabbi after the Hakamat Medina, I thought. So it must have been the 50s. Yeah. So he says, "Vehen emet ki b'shelot shvot mishpatei Uziel katav shabiyot she'adavar matzui." So you can see this is coming from the old days. She'adavar matzui b'ma'or chashmal alul lechabot lepeta be'emtza seudah. He says the problem with chashmal, the problem with electricity is it goes out too often. He must have known about Pepco,
Now they're learning Yerushalayim.
Right now, but this it's extreme.
So you see what we are.
The extreme conditions, yeah.
Things haven't changed.
Right, but in those days,
Not
even in regular circumstances, electricity wasn't reliable. Okay, like it is today. So he said it's more. Today we would laugh at this, but in those days he said, it's more reliable to have a candle than to have chashmal. Because chashmal is going to go out.
No, but actually, a ner could go out too.
Right, exactly. But it shows you how precarious the electrical work must have been back then. That he said it was more reliable to have a candle than to have an electric light. Okay? So he says, therefore you can't rely on it. Why? Because what's the reason why you need a Shabbat candle to begin with? And this speaks to your point, Al. The reason you need a Shabbat candle is because of Oneg Shabbat. Because you want to enjoy the Shabbat meal. It's so that you enjoy the Shabbat meal. Well, if you need to enjoy the Shabbat meal and you know that those candles are going to go out in the middle, because you have Pepco as your electric company, right? And you know that the power is going to go out, better that you should have a candle. That's what he said. Now, Chacham Ovadia says, Ulam nir'ah ki lefia matzav kayom. But it seems like nowadays, En makom lachashasha zabarov kechol hamekomot. He says this is not really a concern nowadays. She'en apsakat zerem hachashmal mitzuya el rak la'itim rechokot meod. Because nowadays we don't have a power going out very often. V'imbanu lachush lezeh, and this is what Al said. Haragam b'ner shemnu ptila kore lefamim shnichpa be'emtza seudah. It also happens all the time that a regular candle, will go out in the middle of the meal. If not, probably even more often. If you're going to be concerned about the candle going out, there's no end to the concerns. We don't worry. Because uncommon, infrequent occurrences, we don't have to base our halachic principle on things that are very infrequent and unusual. And he cites others who say the same thing. But then he says in the end, he quotes several chachamim who support the idea of using chashmal for Shabbat candles, and reject the various concerns that are raised, such as it might go out. Ve'adiraba, it says in underlined, V'nerot shemen matzui hadavar yoter. Okay, this is who's speaking here is the Yaskil Abdi. This is one of the Sephardic Chachamim in the generation before Chacham Ovadia writes that when it comes to oil candles, it's even more common. That he says that it's more common that the oil candle is going to go out than the electricity. Because the electric light is clear and you get more enjoyment out of electric light than who would choose a candle over electric light? Nobody. It's much better. Yeah. ומכל מקום נראה שכל שאפשר למצוא נרות שמן או שבה עדיף יותר לצאת בהם לידי חובת הדלקת הנרות של שבת או לברך עליהם בלי שום פקפוק. Okay? He says that in any case, now this is Chacham Ovadia summarizing, basically bringing it to a close. He says, listen, if you can find oil candles or you can find wax candles, it's better because then you have you don't have any doubt. There's no machloket that they're valid. Okay, although wax candles there is a machloket, but we accept the view that there is no concern. It's also obvious that you're doing it l'chvod Shabbat because normally we don't use candles and we're using candles instead of electricity. However, he says if you don't have any option other than electric lights, not only can you use electric lights for Shabbat candles, you can even say the bracha lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. So if you're in the hotel and you're going to light one of the lights in your hotel room as your Shabbat candle, and you're going to leave it on, obviously, for Shabbat, you can say the bracha lahadlik ner shel Shabbat.
There's also the danger aspect.
There's a danger aspect, yeah, and that's why they won't let you do it anyways. And that's the conclusion.
The danger aspect, Rabbi.
What?
Speaking about the danger aspect.
Yeah.
So if you light Shabbat candles, and let's say you go out to dinner because you're invited, you have to leave them on.
So according to the Sephardic
Yeah.
position, Ashkenazim have a different minhag in this.
Yeah.
But the Sephardic position is you don't, if you're eating in someone else's house, you don't light candles at home because the nerot of where you're eating fulfill the mitzvah. Because the whole concept is that there should be a ner daluk in the place where you're having your Friday night dinner. That's the whole purpose of it. The whole purpose.
Ashkenazim also do that.
They also do that. I wasn't sure. I think they have different. I think it depends. It depends on the community.
100% because like by us we don't. I mean I light because I'm in an apartment, but by our family we don't light until we're married. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So in Sephardic tradition, I know in some Ashkenazim also follow this. Some like Lithuanian, and some don't. But among the Sfaradim, the halakha is because the whole takana was that there should be a ner daluk, not in your house. What do you need a candle burning in your house for? What? It's so that it will be there for Shabbat dinner. So if you're going to somebody's house, make sure they're lighting Shabbat candles, and you fulfill the mitzvah with that. So that it doesn't become a problem. The real problem is Chanukah candles, because Chanukah has to be in the place where you live, not in the place where you eat. So if you're going to somebody's house to have a Chanukah party, you can't,
For Hanukkah, you have at least half an hour.
Right.
After half an hour,
You don't have to worry. Right, you don't have to worry anymore. True.
But another thing. When they talk about Nerot Shabbat,
Yeah.
they talk about shemen, oil.
Right.
But it also means candles, no?
Any candles, right? Candles, because the wax is considered to be a type of fuel.
By the way, do you know Dan Bibo?
Yeah,
His house burned down because of.
They were invited for Shabbat. They
Left the Shabbat
they
candle.
left the Shabbat candle.
This was a lot.
I remember. It was a few years ago because I was here.
Insurance doesn't cover it, if you do that.
Really?
Really?
The insurance usually, if you have a lit candle.
If you leave an
I
unattended
remember
candle.
his insurance, he was able to build a big, beautiful house.
Well,
So it's an unattended candle.
Even
It's
his
not.
new house, it's.
Well, in either case, it's definitely dangerous, and you shouldn't leave unattended candles. so you should make sure to make your plans accordingly. But really, according to the halacha, at least of many, and certainly for Sfaradim, the halacha is that you do not light candles at home if you're going out. You rely on the candles that are lit out, and that makes it safer too. Ends up being safer.
So is this the final
So this seems to be the later conclusion of Chacham Ovadia, and the reason why I say that is because if you turn the page, Yabia Omer, which is his more detailed, as we've seen in all of the classes, the more detailed, meticulous, involved tshuvot are in Yabia Omer. They're more for the scholars. Yechaveh Da'at was more for the Hamon Am. That was for the common people. In this tshuva, he doesn't give such a simple conclusion. He basically concludes you can't say a bracha on this one. So my assumption is that he later changed his mind to allow it, not the other way around.
This is a later.
In other words, right, the Chaved Da'at I think was later, because Yabia Omer, he says you can't say a bracha, but if you don't have any other option, light the electric light, but don't say a bracha.
Right.
By the way, it seems to be very often you find that the same rabbi in a later...
Changes his mind. Oh, he changes his mind
The
anytime.
one I remember very well is with Moshe Feinstein on Thanksgiving.
They're changing, yeah, I mean...
The original...
There's a famous Rashi where he says that I had one explanation of the Talmud and I realized I was wrong, so I changed it to this, A real Chacham has to change his mind sometimes.
Well, because...
In America, we think that anybody who changes their mind, they're flaky. Right? We say, a politician that changed his mind, he must be to get more votes or this and that. But if somebody never changed their mind about anything, how are they thinking? You never change your mind about anything? Of course. Now, we're going to do highlights of a longer tshuva. It's very detailed. But he starts out with a question, a broader question, which is, what is the mitzvah of Nerot Shabbat? And this is in Yabia Omer, section, it's volume 2, and letter number 17, Siman Yud Zayin. So he starts out with the question of, what is the real mitzvah? Is it that there be a lit candle in your house? Or that you light a candle? In other words, is there a ma'aseh mitzvah? Or a result? If it's lit from... And the question is, of course, the practical ramification of that would be, if you had a candle that was lit from beforehand, and you just let it burn through Shabbat, is that good enough? Or do you have to light right before Shabbat? So that was question number 1. That we need to know. And obviously, if you conclude that the candle being lit already is also good enough, that's a strong argument in favor of electricity, because that means that how I get the light doesn't really matter so much. The fact that there's light there is what matters.
A related question, which I don't know if it's resolved, is what happens if you you don't have enough time to get home to light a candle at home. So you happen to be in some place where you can stop and light a candle. Is that considered?
No, it has to be in your house. It has to be in the place you're going to eat.
Okay, so if you're not going to eat there,
it wouldn't count.
Even though you've done it before Shabbat and so
it's not just lighting the candle alone.
And you cannot do it at home, then you
would be patur. But okay. I mean, I knew somebody who, what they did was they said, listen, I knew somebody did this. They got up in the morning. They said, I'm going to get in for Shabbat 1 second before. I'm not going to have time to light candles. So they went in the morning and they lit one of those yard site candles 24 hours in the morning. So then when they got home, they had 2 candles already lit. They didn't have to worry. The candles were lit before Shabbat.
So
now, according to, in other words, this would be the same issue. Is it Sheyeh ner daluk babayit? Okay, Sheyeh ner daluk babayit means that there's a lit candle and it's there. But if it's lahadlik ner, you didn't do, because it has to be right before. It has to be l'chvod Shabbat, right before Shabbat.
No, but you're saying it has to be both, because if a guy lights a candle before
it has
Shabbat,
to be both. Right.
On his way home, that doesn't count.
It certainly has to be Sheyeh ner daluk. The question is, does it matter whether I did the performance right before Shabbat?
Yeah.
Right? So that's question number 1. And in the end, he says that it might be a machloket, or it could be that everybody agrees that you need, from the fact that we say the bracha lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, it sounds like it's an action that you do. It's not just that the candle has to be burning. Now, if you turn over to page Samech, he says an interesting thing here. He says that there's a chidush that comes out of this. What is the chidush? That if, let's say, somebody lit the candle. Now we know the halacha of Chanukah candles, for instance, is that kavta en zakukla, which means if you lit the Chanukah candle and it went out, even before the 30 minutes, you don't have to relight it. Kavta en zakukla, even if it's not Shabbat, you don't have to. You can.
Really?
You can, but you don't
I
have
had
to.
one that went out, and I was lighting it while I was lighting I just relit.
Yeah, you can relight it, but you don't have to. But you're allowed to. So you don't have to. So what about Shabbat candles? So he says, once you say that the mitzvah, part of the mitzvah is sheyihyeh ner daluk babayit. So that means that if it went out before Shabbat started, let's say you lit your candles 20 minutes before Shabbat started. 10 minutes later, you see, it went out. So he says, according to this, you should have to go back. He says, the halacha, Shabbat didn't start yet. You go back and you relight it, because it's not enough. Chanukah, you don't have to go back and relight, because the action is all you have to do. Once the action is done, you're done. But Shabbat, you need the light to be there. If the light went out, it's not enough that you did a lighting. Oh, I've satisfied my obligation. No, you're not going to have a light in the house.
Yeah, but what about, and I don't know if this is the difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, it is said that if you light a candle and you didn't put in your mind and say that, however, I'm
not accepting Shabbat.
Yeah, so if you didn't do that, it would sound like you're not allowed to relight.
Well, listen, if you accepted Shabbat when you lit the candle, according to Sfaradim, according to the Sephardic way, we say it's not presumed you're accepting Shabbat when you light the candles. It's not presumed.
Yeah, but to Ashkenazim...
For Ashkenazim, I think they presume it unless you say otherwise. But in either case, it doesn't matter so much. If you accepted Shabbat, then you definitely can't go back and relight the candle. There's no question, no matter what. So you lost the candle, that's all. If you didn't accept Shabbat yet, you should go back and light it, because you're going to miss the major component of the mitzvah, which is to have the candle lit at the meal. Now, either way, so he goes, now let's get to our subject, which is lighting an electric bulb considered lighting? Now that we've established that there are two components to the mitzvah. One is that you have a ner daluk babayit, that there's a candle burning in the house, which you're going to have. The question is, and we also established that you need ma'aseh ha'hadlaka, you need the action of lighting. So then, is lighting the electric candle considered lighting is going to be a valid question. And he starts out by saying, the fact that when you flip the switch, what do you really do? You're simply allowing the current to flow. You're just allowing the current to flow through. You're not doing anything. It's not proactive.
Like a grama.
Right, it's indirect, because you're allowing the current to flow through now, and for the light to come on. So he says, would this be considered lighting? And he says that we treat it as lighting. We treat electricity as lighting. We do not treat it as indirect. He says, in fact, and he quotes an interesting thing from the Geonim. He says in the Tshuvot of the Geonim, it says that their custom was that they would have candles lit all the time. So what did they do? Right before Shabbat, they would add a little bit of oil to the candle, and they would fix the wick a little bit, and they would say the bracha. In other words, they had the candle all the time anyway. It wasn't a new candle. They didn't even necessarily have to do anything. They would just go over to it, add a little bit of something, or fix the pitila, fix the wick, and they would say the bracha because they were dedicating it to Shabbat. He says, certainly that's not going to be, turning on an electric light is no less than that. It's, if anything, better than that. And then he says, we don't even need any of these discussions, because the fact is that flipping a switch is considered lighting. That's it. Flipping a switch is considered lighting. And then you'll see on the top left, I summarized some of the subjects. Is it considered direct or indirect? Okay? So, in other words, is lighting, since what you do is you flip the switch, which is mechaber, in other words, it connects it to it allows the current to flow. Is that considered indirect? Because what you did was you basically created a bridge, so to speak, for the current to travel. You didn't directly light the candle. So he says, even if you say it's indirect, where does it say that the lighting of the Shabbat candle has to be direct? If I spin the wheel of fortune, and on the end of the wheel of fortune is a little flame, and the flame goes around, and the flame then touches the wick and lights it. Did I light the candle? Is that not a Shabbat candle? Who says it has to be direct, that I went and I put the flame to the wick? It never says that. So therefore, that's not even an issue.
But, Geram refers to not necessarily...
Koach, grama, all these things, right?
So he's saying that lighting an electric light
It's considered direct.
is considered, but it's not allowable instead of lighting candles for Shabbat.
Well, he's still exploring that. So now he's saying, well, really, we consider it lighting. We consider it, even if you're going to say it's indirect lighting. Who says you need direct lighting for Shabbat candles? It doesn't say that. So maybe it would be good And then he goes into a discussion about, he goes into somewhat of a tangent, more about whether it's about the lighting, whether we can, how we treat the electricity that's in the, that's in the power plant, and whether we consider the fire already there, or is it something new, and so on. He gets into somewhat of a tangent, and he goes into Ner Chanukah a little bit on the next page also, and discussing that. So we're going to skip Samach Aleph, and if you come to Samach Bet, he says in the underlining on top, he says that, and here's a really, really interesting piece. He quotes from Harava Gaona Mifursam, Rim Toledano, okay, who says, Shenir'a be'enav, and this is a fascinating point, Shema shekatuv adlaka osam mitzvah. Now, how did they prove that lighting the Shabbat candle is a mitzvah? Not just having it lit, but lighting it? Because we say, lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. And the Talmud, when it questions, is there a mitzvah to light Nerot Chanukah, or just that the Nerot Chanukah are lit? Do you actually have to light it? Or if you have a 5-year-old child do it, it's enough, as long as it's done. So they said, you have to light it. How do we know that you have to light it? Because it says, Lahadlik ner shel Chanukah, or Lahadlik ner Chanukah. It's an action. Lehadlik. It's a maaseh. So the same thing with Shabbat. Right? It says Lahadlik ner. So, but he says, fascinating thing. Dibru bahoveh. They were speaking in their time, the Chachamim. Meaning, Shekol hanerot hayu dolkot ba'esh. What kind of candle did you have that wasn't with fire back then? Aval, hu adin gam ken b'ner hashmal. Okay? The fikata kaftor mikre hadlaka. That even though it's not the same exact form of lighting that they would have recognized in the times of the Talmud, the fact is you're shedding light. They didn't care whether you were doing it by holding a match to a wick or rubbing 2 sticks together. They just said your action has to cause the light to shine. And in their days, the only way you could do that would be in the natural way that we know. But now that we have electricity, of course they would have accepted that as a valid way as well. And now if you turn over to the end of the tshuva, it's very interesting how it's different than what we've seen up to now in Samach Gimel. At the very end he says, Hamuram mikol amor she'en lanu tam maspik lomar she'en yotzin yidei chovato ba'adlakat ner hachashmal lechvot Shabbat. Or yidei chova ba'adlakat ner hachashmal lechvot Shabbat. He says that there's no proof. We can't conclusively decide that it's no good to use electricity for Shabbat, for the Shabbat candles. Mikol makom tov v'nachon lachush devrei machmirim bazeh echad efshar. But when you have the option to use real candle, you should use it. So far that's the same. Uladlik gam ner shemen ulevarech alav. And it's true, you're going to have electric lights in your house, but you should put also a real candle. Ubazeh yehekir sheudleku lichvod Shabbat. And this is also more nikar. It's more discernible that you're lighting it for Shabbat. Uvartenu akdusha shavodat chashmal nasid ba'avonotenu arabim al yidei Yisrael. And in Eretz Yisrael, where unfortunately Jews are the ones working the electricity on Shabbat, which is another whole issue, we don't want to use it for the Ner Shabbat because we know it's being brought about by Chilul Shabbat. It's not really necessarily true because most of it works automatically. They're not pushing a button every second to make your chashmal work. There's some guy sitting at a desk. And if there's a problem, maybe the technician goes to fix it, but who's to say that your electricity is really being fixed? Anyway.
But there's people in Israel that they follow the Chazon Ish and they'll have a generator.
They have a generator for Shabbat. Yeah, I've heard of that.
I had neighbors like that.
Yeah, I've heard of it. And you know who does it too? The Kara'im.
So what do they do?
Kara'im.
I didn't know that.
The Kara'im say
electricity.
that you can't do it for more than one reason, I think. But one of the reasons that Kara'im say is because you have to pay for it. Because you have to pay for the electricity, so it's like you're buying something because they're charging you for the chashmal.
Yes, but it's just like if you're in a hotel and you prepay for your meal.
Right, but we're not Karaites. They might think that's a problem. I don't know. Anyway, okay. So it says, there's a line missing here in the miluim in the back of the in the back of the book. That's why on this it didn't show up here, but there's actually a marking that the Miluim, he fixed the sentence. There's something missing. You can see somebody like wrote a Y in there because there's something missing. Basically, what he said was "Bevadai she'en levarech al zeh." Okay, so it's very interesting. So in Shelot and Shuvot Yabia Omer Chelek Bet Shuva Yud Zayin, he says, if you don't have any other means of, and it says here, it was in Cairo. He wrote this in Cairo. Right, in Cairo he wrote the Shuvah. So when he wrote this, it was earlier, and he wrote, you can, if you don't have any option but electricity, use the electricity by all means for your Shabbat candles, but do not say a bracha. However, later on, when he wrote Yechaveh Da'at, he changed his mind, and he said that, you know what, if you don't, you should, he still said, Lechatchila, you should go for the natural candle that we would normally use, a traditional candle. But if you're in a situation where you have no choice, you can use the electric light, and you can even say a bracha on it. And that was his later final decision. Now what's fascinating here, again, is not so much what did Chacham Ovadia think, and next time, Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to do the most comprehensive tshuva that he wrote about electricity, about use on Shabbat, use on Yom Tov, and how he dealt with it. It's not so important, and he evolved in his understanding of electricity as well. It's not so important how he dealt with the issue of electricity, specifically what he understood about the physics of electricity or the mechanics of electricity. What's interesting to me, and what should be interesting to the halachic mind, is how halacha dissects itself, basically. Because 2,000 years ago, a candle was a candle. But now, we can have light without a candle. We can have light without a flame. We can have fire without a flame. Light without a flame. We can have a lighting of something that gives light that doesn't involve any fire at all, just by flipping a switch. So what was essential when the rabbis made a takana, lahadlik ner shel Shabbat? How much of the lighting of the Shabbat candle did they say had to be done in the original way? What was their intent? Did they say we're fixing the form? The form is that you take a flame and you light a candle, the conventional form, or no, you could separate out the parts. They didn't really care that you take a flame and light the wick. That was just how people did it back then. That's just the way it happened to be, but they meant any way you can bring about light is good enough. And they didn't mean that you had to have fuel in a wick. That was just the only thing that they knew, but they would have seen electricity and said that works too. So the question is, how much of halacha is the form that was fixed by the Chachamim, and how much of halacha is the concept behind it? Sometimes we have law that is, if we understand the law as being fixed in a certain form, then we can't change the form, even if we have modern methods that are better, that are more effective or more efficient. But if the Chachamim didn't intend for the form, they intended for the concept, and the form that they gave us was just the form that they had, because that was all that existed, so then it's possible to say, well, which parts of the original form are dispensable, and what's the essential concept, and go with the concept instead of the form. So this is really one of the biggest challenges that Chachamim in all generations have faced. How much of the halacha was form? How much of the halacha was concept? Another example, very common example, famous example, is Chazarat Hashatz. Why do we repeat the Amidah? Because they didn't have Sidurim. Now we have Sidurim, yeah. But was that something where they made the form of Tefillah? The Chachamim said you must have this form, that there's Chazarat Hashatz, even if everybody has a Sidur, it doesn't matter? Or no, the concept. So since the concept becomes, the application of the concept no longer applies. Kiddush in the Bet Knesset. Right? Why did they have it? It wasn't that they made, that's the machloket. Some Rishonim say, that's the tzura. They said you must have Kiddush in the Bet Knesset. Yes, they did it because of a certain reason, because people used to eat in the Bet Knesset. Now we don't have that. It doesn't matter. You still have to do it because that was the form that they said that you have to do it. Or maybe no. Maybe we say it's the concept. Right, so they had people say.
So, the mitzvah of lighting the Rosh Shabbat,